Story number 1.
A heavy silence blanketed the snow-covered forest as the wind howled through the leafless branches. It was a night so cold that the very air seemed frozen in place, trapping the world in an eerie stillness. The sky, an inky black void, offered no relief from the oppressive darkness. The storm had come suddenly, swallowing the last traces of warmth from the earth, and with it, a sense of foreboding settled over the small town of Black Hollow. Miles away from the town, nestled deep in the woods, stood an old hunting cabin. It had once belonged to a man named Thomas Caldwell, a reclusive hunter who had vanished without a trace decades ago. The locals avoided the place, muttering superstitions about the spirits that supposedly haunted it. But Henry Whitmore, a seasoned outdoorsman, never paid much attention to such tales. That night, Henry had been hiking back to his truck after a long day of tracking deer when the storm overtook him. He had no choice but to seek shelter in the abandoned cabin. As he trudged through the knee-deep snow, his flashlight flickered, casting ghostly shadows against the twisted trees. His breath curled in the frozen air, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. When he finally reached the cabin, the structure loomed before him, half buried in snow, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of ice. He pushed open the door with some effort, the hinges shrieking in protest. The interior was exactly as he expected, dusty, cold, and smelling of damp wood. His flashlight beam danced over the worn furniture, the stone fireplace, and the single rocking chair that sat eerily in the corner. There were old hunting trophies on the walls, their glass eyes reflecting the dim light. Henry exhaled sharply and set his pack down. The storm outside was growing fiercer, the wind howling like a wounded animal. He moved to the fireplace and began gathering some of the old firewood stacked beside it. With some effort, he managed to start a small fire, the orange glow pushing back the darkness, giving him a sense of uneasy comfort. As he warmed his hands, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned his head slowly, scanning the room, but found nothing. Just the old furniture and the empty windows, revealing only the swirling snow outside. "Damn wind's making me jumpy," he muttered to himself. Settling down, he ate a protein bar from his pack and prepared to wait out the storm. The cabin creaked in the wind, its old wooden beams groaning like a living thing. Then, without warning, the rocking chair in the corner gave a soft creak, shifting ever so slightly. Henry's pulse quickened. He stared at the chair, his breath held tight in his throat. There was no breeze inside the cabin, no reason for it to move. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his flashlight beam steady on the chair. "Hello?" His voice barely carried in the thick silence. Nothing. Swallowing hard, Henry forced himself to look away. It was an old house, after all. Wood shrank and shifted in the cold. He shook his head and returned to the fire, convincing himself that exhaustion was playing tricks on him. An hour passed, the fire crackled, the wind outside screamed, and the rocking chair remained still. Henry had started to doze off when a sharp noise jolted him awake. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came from the front door. Henry sat up straight, his skin crawling. He reached for his flashlight and hesitated. Who the hell would be out in this storm? The knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. Slowly, he rose to his feet and stepped toward the door. His hand hovered over the handle as he took a steadying breath. Then, in one swift motion, he yanked it open. Nothing. Just the raging storm, the wind throwing flurries of snow into his face. There were no footprints in the freshly fallen snow outside, no sign that anyone had been there. Henry slammed the door shut, locking it this time. His body was tense, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his mind raced for a rational explanation, but deep inside, a nameless dread took hold. He backed away from the door and turned toward the fire, only to freeze. The rocking chair was moving. Not just a slight creak, not just a shift in the wood, it was rocking, back and forth, slow and deliberate. Henry's throat tightened as the air in the room grew impossibly cold. His breath turned thick, heavy puffs of fog, and the fire suddenly flickered, struggling against an unseen force. Then, from the far corner of the cabin, a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was barely audible, yet it sent ice down Henry's spine. He spun toward the sound, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The shadows in the room seemed deeper, darker, moving like something was shifting within them. And then he saw it. A shape, a figure standing near the rocking chair. It was tall, gaunt, and wrong. Its features were obscured, but Henry could make out hollow eyes, empty voids staring straight into his soul. The thing took a step forward. Henry stumbled back, his body screaming to run, but his legs felt like lead. The fire flickered again, then snuffed out completely. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Henry's breath hitched as the temperature dropped even further, the air thick with the scent of something rotten. He could feel it now. Something was in the room with him. A whisper slithered through the silence. "You can't leave." Henry bolted. He lunged for the door, fumbling with the lock, his fingers numb with fear. Just as he yanked it open, a force slammed the door shut with an inhuman strength, throwing him backward onto the floor. Then the figure was there, right in front of him. It bent down, its face inches from his, its breath ice against his skin. Its voice was barely above a whisper, but it was filled with ancient malice. "He never left, and neither will you." Henry's scream never left his throat. The next morning, the storm had calmed. The townsfolk who dared to venture into the woods found Henry's truck parked along the trail, but there was no sign of him. A search party was sent out, but they found nothing, only the abandoned cabin, its door wide open, a layer of frost coating the walls. The only trace of Henry was his flashlight, lying on the floor beside the cold, motionless, rocking chair. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The wind howled through the trees like a distant scream, carrying with it a flurry of snow that blanketed the empty road. It was the kind of cold that seeped into the bones, the kind that made even the hardiest traveler think twice about continuing their journey. Tom Branson gripped the steering wheel of his old truck, knuckles white as he navigated the winding mountain road. His breath came in short, anxious bursts, fogging up the windshield despite the heater running at full blast. He had driven this route dozens of times before, but tonight, something felt different. The night was too quiet, the snow falling too heavily, and an unease settled in his gut like a lead weight. He had left his mother's house in a small mountain town hours ago, much later than he intended. He was supposed to be home before dark, but dinner ran long, and before he knew it, the sun had dipped behind the mountains, leaving him alone on the desolate road. There wasn't a single car in sight, no headlights piercing the darkness, no taillights in the distance. Just him and the snow. As he rounded a bend, his headlights flickered, a momentary dimming, almost as if something had passed in front of them. He squinted into the darkness, but there was nothing, just the unrelenting snowfall and the towering trees on either side of the road. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision. Tom's foot instinctively hovered over the brake. "What the hell was that?" he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Then it happened again. Something darted across the road just ahead, a dark figure, barely visible against the snow. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly before coming to a stop. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. He peered through the windshield, searching the darkness for any sign of what had crossed the road. Nothing. The only sound was the wind whistling through the trees, carrying whispers that didn't quite belong. Tom exhaled sharply. Just an animal, he told himself. Maybe a deer. But deep down, he wasn't convinced. He took a shaky breath and pressed the gas, inching forward. The snow crunched beneath the tires as he continued down the road, his grip on the wheel tightening. Then, his radio crackled to life. Static. Just static. Tom frowned and reached for the dial, adjusting the frequency. Nothing but an eerie white noise filled the cab. He turned it off. The truck lurched suddenly. Tom's head snapped forward as the vehicle came to a jarring halt. The engine sputtered, then died. Damn it! He turned the key, but the truck refused to start. Outside, the snow fell harder. A sharp, rhythmic knock sounded against the driver's side window. Tom's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head. There was nothing there, just the darkness and the swirling snow. His chest rose and fell in rapid succession. He must have imagined it, the wind, the stress, the isolation. It was messing with his head. A loud thump rattled the roof of the truck. Tom jumped, his pulse hammering. He fumbled with his seatbelt, his fingers numb from fear. Another thump, this time from the hood. And then he saw it. A figure stood directly in front of the truck, illuminated by the weak glow of the headlights. A woman. She was barefoot, wearing a thin, tattered white dress that barely covered her pale skin. Her long, dark hair clung to her face, wet from the snow. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't breathing. Tom's mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his body was frozen in place. The woman tilted her head, her lifeless eyes locking onto his. Then she took a step forward. Tom's fight or flight instincts kicked in. He reached for his phone, his trembling fingers barely able to grip it. No signal. The woman took another step. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. She raised a hand, a bloodied hand. The realization sent a wave of nausea through him. Tom fumbled for the ignition again, turning the key frantically. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The woman's lips parted slightly. And then she disappeared. Not into the woods, not into the darkness. She simply vanished. Tom didn't wait to question it. He floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning for a moment before gaining traction. The truck lurched forward and he sped down the road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. The air inside the truck grew colder. Frost crept along the inside of the windshield, despite the heater blasting hot air. Then from the back seat came a whisper. A voice. "You shouldn't have left me." Tom's scream was swallowed by the storm. Story the end.
Story number 3.
On a cold, snowy night, a small town in the Midwest was blanketed by a heavy storm. The wind howled through the streets, causing the snow to swirl in chaotic patterns. People had already settled in for the evening, their windows shut tight against the bitter chill. The world outside seemed to vanish into a dense white fog, as though the storm itself had swallowed everything whole. Inside, the warmth of homes provided comfort against the harsh cold, and the fire crackled merrily in fireplaces. In a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of town, Sarah Miller sat in front of a roaring fire. She had recently moved into the house with her husband Mark after their wedding. They had spent the day unpacking, arranging furniture, and making their new house feel like a home. It was an old place, one that had been passed down through generations. The creaky floors and drafty windows had always given it an eerie charm, but Sarah had always been drawn to older homes, their character and history somehow comforting to her. She had never thought much about the stories people whispered about the place. That evening, Mark had to drive into town for work. He worked as a mechanic, and despite the storm, he had a repair job to finish for a local farmer. Sarah had insisted he stay home, but he had insisted on going. "It's just a bit of snow," he had said with a grin. "I'll be fine." She had reluctantly agreed, watching him drive off into the snowstorm, the sound of his truck's engine slowly fading until it was swallowed by the wind. Now, as Sarah sat in front of the fire, she felt a creeping unease. It was strange being alone in the house, especially with the storm raging outside. The wind battered the old windows and she could hear the occasional creak of the wooden beams in the walls. The house was old, very old, and it was full of strange noises at night. As the fire crackled and popped, Sarah glanced around the room. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of long-dead relatives, their eyes seeming to follow her movements. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, and she found herself imagining faces in the darkness. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts from her mind. It was just the storm playing tricks on her senses. There was no reason to be afraid. But then she heard it. A faint sound, like the soft shuffle of footsteps on the floor above. Sarah froze, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. The house was quiet, save for the howling wind outside and the crackling of the fire. But now, there it was again. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate steps, as though someone was walking slowly across the floor of the attic. Sarah stood up, her pulse quickening. She had made sure to check the house before settling in for the night. The windows were locked, the doors secure. Mark hadn't mentioned anyone else coming by, and the storm had kept the rest of the town indoors. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She called out into the silence. "Mark?" she said, her voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. She waited a moment, straining to hear anything above the storm. The house creaked again, and there were the footsteps, louder this time. They were definitely coming from the attic. The attic. Sarah's mind raced. She had been up there earlier that day while unpacking, and there was nothing unusual, just some old furniture, dusty boxes, and forgotten belongings. But now those footsteps seemed to be coming closer, as though whatever or whoever was up there was moving toward the stairs. Her first instinct was to call Mark, but she realized her phone was on the table by the window. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and decided to investigate. The fear gnawing at her was overpowering, but she didn't want to appear foolish. She walked to the foot of the stairs, her breath shallow, every step she took feeling heavier than the last. The wind rattled the windows, and the door to the attic creaked ominously as she slowly ascended the stairs. The old wood groaned beneath her feet, and the air grew colder as she neared the attic door. The faint footsteps had stopped now, leaving only the eerie silence. She reached the top of the stairs and stood in front of the door. There was no sound from inside, but she felt the unmistakable sense of being watched. With trembling hands, she reached for the door handle and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit attic full of shadows. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost suffocating. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. The old wooden beams above creaked as the house settled, and she let out a shaky breath. Perhaps she had imagined the footsteps after all. But then she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. The window in the far corner of the attic was wide open. Snow had begun to blow in, and a soft layer of white dusted the floor beneath the window. The cold air seeped into the room, causing her breath to fog in front of her. The window had been closed earlier that day. She was certain of it. Her heart began to race as she stepped closer to the window, her mind trying to make sense of what was happening. Could someone have entered the house? The thought was absurd. There was no sign of forced entry, and the door had been locked. But the window, it was wide open. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the edge of the frame, and as she did, she heard something soft, like a whisper, barely audible above the wind. She froze, straining to listen. There it was again, a low, almost unintelligible murmur coming from somewhere deeper in the attic. It was as though someone or something was speaking in hushed tones, too faint to understand, but unmistakably there. The sound grew louder, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears, the blood rushing to her head. She wanted to run, but she couldn't move. Suddenly the whispering stopped, and the temperature in the attic seemed to drop even further. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in around her. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that made her jump. The sound of the wind outside was drowned out by the ringing silence in the attic. The only sound now was her own frantic breathing. Then from the corner of her eye, she saw something. A figure, shrouded in shadow, standing near the far wall. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as though it were not fully part of the room. The figure's face was hidden in the darkness, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, cold and unblinking. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. All she could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, as the figure slowly began to move toward her. The air grew heavier, suffocating, and the temperature plummeted. The figure's presence seemed to warp the very space around it, and Sarah felt a chill that cut to her bones. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, pulling her in as though the room itself was alive. She wanted to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't respond. The figure stopped just a few feet from her, its presence overwhelming. A soft voice, like the whispering she had heard earlier, echoed in her mind. "You should not have come," it murmured, the words sending a wave of terror through her. The voice was not human. It was ancient, hollow, as though it had not spoken in centuries. And yet, it felt all too real, as if it were inside her very soul. Sarah's mind raced, desperately trying to process what was happening. She had heard the stories, the ones people had told in hushed voices, stories of the house being cursed, of spirits that never left. She had dismissed them, convinced they were just old superstitions. But now, as she stood face to face with whatever was in the attic with her, she realized how wrong she had been. The figure raised its hand, and the temperature dropped even further, causing Sarah's teeth to chatter uncontrollably. The shadow seemed to ripple like smoke, and it spoke again, its voice now filled with malice. "You are mine," it whispered, and in that moment, Sarah knew she would never leave the attic alive. The shadows closed in around her, suffocating her, and her last thought before everything went dark was of Mark, of how she would never see him again. The storm raged outside, but inside the farmhouse there was only silence. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The wind howled outside, carrying with it the bite of a winter storm that had begun hours ago. Snow flurries whipped past the window in thick sheets, obscuring the view beyond. The trees stood stark against the white sky, their branches bare, swaying under the pressure of the gusts. The storm had come without warning, a sudden shift in weather that had caught everyone off guard. The town had been plunged into darkness earlier in the evening when the power lines were knocked out by the heavy snow, and now all that remained was the crackling of a fire and the sound of the wind battering against the house. In the dim glow of the firelight, Claire sat curled up on the couch, a thick blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, the dance of the fire offering some comfort against the cold. Her house was old, much older than most in the small town, and its creaks and groans had become familiar to her over the years. But tonight, as the storm raged outside, those sounds seemed different, almost alive. It was the kind of night that made her feel like the world outside had stopped, as if the storm had erased everything, leaving only the house and its quiet, oppressive presence. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered in the pit of her stomach, a cold dread that wouldn't go away. She had always loved this old house, inherited from her grandmother after she passed away a few years ago. The house had a long history in the family, and there was something comforting about that connection to the past. It was the house Claire had grown up in, and though she had lived elsewhere for a while, she had returned after her grandmother's death, hoping that being back in familiar surroundings would help her heal from the loss. But as the wind howled outside, she couldn't deny that there was something unsettling about the house. She had heard the stories. Everyone in town had. The strange occurrences that had plagued the house for decades. Doors that would open on their own, whispers in the walls, the feeling of being watched when no one was around. When Claire was younger, she had dismissed those stories as the overactive imaginations of the townsfolk. But now, living in the house again, she found herself questioning whether there might be something to them after all. The fire popped, snapping her out of her thoughts. Claire shifted uncomfortably, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The wind had picked up again, and the sound of the storm outside seemed to grow louder, filling the house with an eerie howling. She glanced over at the window, her eyes briefly catching the reflection of herself in the dark glass. She looked back at the fire, a frown forming on her face. There was something off about the house tonight. The air felt too thick, too heavy. The storm, the isolation, everything seemed to heighten the sensations, making her feel like she wasn't truly alone in the house. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. It was just the storm, she told herself. Just the wind. Then came the sound. It started as a faint thud, so quiet that at first Claire wasn't sure if she had heard it at all. She paused, listening. The wind outside howled louder, drowning out any other noise, but then, again, another thud. It was coming from upstairs, a slow, deliberate sound like something or someone was walking in the attic. Her heart began to race. She wasn't sure why, but a sense of dread washed over her. It was impossible for anyone to be up there. She had checked the house earlier that evening before the storm had hit. The attic door had been locked, just as it always was. No one else was supposed to be there. Claire stood up from the couch, her blanket falling to the floor as she moved toward the stairs. The house was still except for the storm outside. She hesitated at the bottom of the staircase, the feeling of something watching her creeping up her spine. The thudding from above continued, slower now, but more distinct. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was up there. Her breath caught in her throat. The attic. The attic had always been a place of mystery for her. When she was a child, it had been a forbidden zone, the one place she wasn't allowed to go. Her grandmother had always kept it locked, never allowing Claire to see what was stored there. As a child, she had been terrified of the attic. There were rumors in town about strange happenings in that room, things that couldn't be explained. People said they had heard noises from up there even when no one was around. But Claire had dismissed them all as nonsense, as childish tales meant to scare people. But now, standing at the bottom of the stairs with that cold dread settling in her stomach, she wasn't so sure. She took a deep breath and made her way up the stairs. The wood creaked under her weight as she climbed, the house groaning in protest. As she reached the top of the stairs, she could feel the temperature drop, a coldness that seemed to seep into her bones. The hallway was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of the fire from below. At the far end of the hall, the attic door stood ajar, just slightly open, as though someone had been there recently. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the door, the cold draft spilling out from the crack. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she pushed the door open. The attic was dark and silent, the only light coming from the faint glow of the hallway. The room was filled with dust and forgotten items, old trunks, boxes of books, and discarded furniture covered in sheets. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But as Claire stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and the cold in the room seemed to settle deeper, like a presence that didn't belong. She scanned the room, her flashlight flickering as she moved it across the cluttered space. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No one was there. But then her light fell on something in the corner. It was a rocking chair. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen it before. The chair was old, made of dark wood, with a faded cushion that was nearly torn apart. It was placed at the farthest corner of the room, near the window. But what made her blood run cold was that the chair was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it rocked back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. Claire took a step back, her mind racing. She had to get out of there. This was too much. But before she could turn to leave, the thudding sound came again. Louder this time. It was coming from behind her, from the far corner of the attic. She spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something, a shadow shifting in the darkness. "Help me." The whisper echoed in her mind, the voice soft and pleading, like a faint memory. Claire froze. She didn't know why, but the voice sounded familiar. She felt her heart beat faster as the room seemed to close in on her, the temperature dropping even further. The rocking chair creaked again, and then there was a sudden movement. Something was there. Something was in the attic with her. Claire turned and fled from the room, her feet pounding against the wooden floor as she rushed back down the stairs. She didn't look back, didn't stop until she was safely in the living room, the door to the attic shut tightly behind her. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the house was silent. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls, but the air still felt wrong. Claire sat on the couch, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had seen the chair rocking. She had heard the voice. There was no explanation for it. But there was one thing she knew for certain. The house was not empty. It never had been. The rest of the night passed in an eerie silence, the storm outside howling, but inside, the house seemed to hold its breath. Claire didn't sleep. She couldn't. She knew she wasn't alone, and that knowledge kept her awake through the long hours, her eyes fixed on the shadows in the corners of the room. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the world outside was blanketed in snow, the landscape pristine and still. But inside the house, the silence remained, thick and suffocating. Claire never went back to the attic. She didn't need to. She knew it was a place that should be left undisturbed. Some things, she realized, were better left alone. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The wind howled through the dense forest, carrying with it sharp flakes of snow that bit into anything exposed. The small town of Black Hollow was already buried under a thick blanket of white, and the temperature had plummeted to levels so extreme that even the wildlife had disappeared into hiding. The old folk in town warned that nights like these weren't just dangerous because of the cold. There were other things that roamed when the world was blanketed in ice. Nathan Carter had never been one to believe in ghost stories. He was a journalist, a man of logic and reason, and he had spent years traveling to remote places, searching for the truth behind folklore and legends. His latest assignment had brought him to Black Hollow, a town that barely showed up on maps, buried deep in the woods of Montana. He had heard whispers of the legend of the frozen widow, a specter that appeared only on the coldest nights of winter, searching for warmth, for companionship, for a soul to claim. It was precisely the kind of thing he loved to debunk. Nathan had rented a small cabin just outside of town where he planned to stay for a week. The place was modest, with only the bare necessities: a fireplace, a bed, a tiny kitchen, and an old wooden rocking chair by the window. The locals had been friendly enough, but he couldn't help but notice the unease in their eyes when he mentioned staying alone on the outskirts. They spoke in hushed voices about the night of the widow's cold, and one old woman had grabbed his hand, warning him not to go outside if he heard knocking at the door. "Don't answer," she had whispered, "no matter how much she begs." Nathan had laughed it off at the time, but now, as he sat by the fire with the wind rattling the windows and the snow falling in sheets outside, he felt an inexplicable heaviness settle in his chest. The power flickered, making the shadows dance wildly across the wooden walls. With a sigh, he reached for his recorder, switching it on. December 12th, 11:47 p.m., he spoke into the device. Black Hollow. The storm has picked up and temperatures are dropping well below freezing. The locals insist that on nights like this, the frozen widow appears, seeking out those foolish enough to be alone. Of course, it's just a story meant to keep people indoors, away from the dangers of exposure. Aye, a knock. Nathan froze mid-sentence. It was faint, barely audible over the roaring wind, but it was there. A slow, deliberate knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. His grip on the recorder tightened. It had to be the wind, or maybe a tree branch knocked loose by the storm. He hesitated, his heartbeat quickening as he remembered the old woman's warning. Don't answer. For several long moments he remained seated, staring at the door. Then curiosity won over fear. He stood, moving cautiously toward it, his breath visible in the cold air. Another knock, this time louder. His fingers trembled as he reached for the handle. He hesitated once more, then pulled the door open. There was nothing, just the empty, snow-covered porch and the howling wind. His breath came in uneven puffs as he stepped out, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The snow stretched undisturbed in all directions. No footprints, no signs of life. Nathan frowned. He had definitely heard something. Shaking his head, he stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. As he turned, his blood ran cold. The rocking chair by the window was moving. Back and forth, back and forth. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows that made it look as though something unseen was sitting there. Nathan's breath came in short gasps. He forced himself to approach, gripping the armrest of the chair to stop its movement. His mind raced for a logical explanation. Perhaps a draft from the chimney? The shifting temperature of the room? And then he saw it. Faint, just barely visible on the frost-covered window. A handprint. From the inside. The air in the cabin felt heavier, just thick with something unseen but undeniably present. The temperature seemed to plummet even further, and suddenly he was aware of a sound, a whisper. Soft, sorrowful. So cold. Nathan turned so fast he nearly tripped over himself. The voice had been right next to his ear. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he stumbled backward, knocking over the table. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but the storm outside was deadly. He had no choice but to stay. Slowly, he forced himself to move, to steady his shaking hands. He reached for his bag, fumbling for his camera. If this was real, if there was even a chance that something supernatural was happening, he needed proof. But when he raised the camera, the battery was dead. Impossible. It had been fully charged. A deep sense of unease settled over him. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to think. He had spent years debunking myths, exposing fakes. He refused to believe that he was dealing with something beyond explanation. Another whisper. This time, a plea. Please, let me in. Nathan backed away from the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then the knocking resumed. Knock, knock, knock. Only this time it wasn't at the door, it was at the window. Slowly his eyes lifted. Outside, in the swirling snow, stood a figure. A woman. Her face was pale, her lips a deep, frost-bitten blue. Her eyes were dark, hollow, filled with an eternal sorrow. Her dress was tattered and thin, completely unsuited for the harsh winter storm. Snowflakes clung to her tangled black hair and her skin glistened with ice. Nathan's breath hitched. The frozen widow. She raised one trembling skeletal hand and pressed it against the glass. Her fingers left streaks of frost in their wake. "I'm so cold." Nathan stumbled backward, his body trembling as the fire suddenly flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight, but it refused to turn on. The knocking grew louder, more desperate. "Please." Nathan clamped his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. It was a trick. It had to be. His mind was playing tricks on him. Then, silence. He dared to open his eyes. She was gone. For several long moments he remained frozen, listening to nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then the door creaked. Slowly, painfully. His stomach dropped as he realized the door was unlocked. But he hadn't unlocked it. A sharp gust of wind blew through the cabin, and the cold that followed was like nothing he had ever felt before. It sank deep into his bones, stealing the warmth from his very soul, and then he felt it. A presence behind him, breath, icy and ragged, against his neck. So, cold. A hand, frozen, brittle, clasped his shoulder. Nathan screamed. The next morning, when the townsfolk arrived to check on him, they found the cabin door wide open, snow drifting inside. Nathan was gone. There were no footprints leading away from the cabin, only a single chair rocking slowly by the window. And on the frost-covered glass, a single handprint from the inside. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The wind howled through the trees, bending the bare branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the heavens. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the ground in a pristine white sheet. It was the kind of cold that cut straight to the bone, an unnatural chill that made the world feel hollow. David Tanner hunched his shoulders and pulled his coat tighter around him as he trudged through the knee-deep snow. He regretted taking this route home, but the main roads were closed due to the blizzard, and he was left with little choice. His truck had skidded off the icy road about 2 miles back, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere. His only option was to make it to the nearest house he had seen along the way, a small, secluded cabin nestled between the trees. His boots crunched against the frozen earth as he forced himself forward, his breath coming out in thick plumes. He could barely see the silhouette of the cabin through the swirling snow, its windows dark as if abandoned. His gut twisted uncomfortably, but he ignored it. He needed shelter. When he finally reached the porch, he banged on the door with numb fists, calling out for help. The wind carried his voice away into the void. He tried the handle. To his relief, the door creaked open, revealing the dark interior. "Hello?" he called, stepping inside. The warmth hit him immediately, wide, unexpected but welcome. A fire burned low in the stone hearth, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Someone had been here recently. "Hello?" he called again, moving further inside. The floorboards groaned under his weight. The cabin was sparsely furnished. An old rocking chair by the fireplace, a wooden table with a single chair, and a tattered couch near the far wall. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, as though it hadn't been used in a long time, despite the fire still burning. David shut the door behind him and rubbed his hands together, trying to regain feeling in his fingers. He couldn't hear the storm as loudly from inside, which was strange given how violently the wind had been howling just moments ago. He walked toward the fire, extending his hands toward the heat. That was when he noticed the footprints. Faint, but unmistakable, a trail of wet footprints led from the door to the couch, and then disappeared. They hadn't come from him. His boots were still dry when he entered. A sickening unease coiled in his stomach. "Is someone here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. A shuffling noise came from the back of the cabin. He turned sharply, heart pounding. There was a single door leading to what he assumed was a bedroom. It stood slightly ajar, blackness yawning from within. The air grew colder. His breath hitched as he took a step forward, compelled by a mixture of fear and curiosity. He reached out, fingers grazing the wooden door, and pushed it open. The room was empty, just a simple bed and a window that had been frosted over with ice. But the feeling of being watched pressed down on him like a physical weight. He could almost hear breathing. Soft, shallow, but definitely there. David backed away, his skin crawling. The fire in the hearth crackled loudly, making him jump. He turned, peering into the dimly lit living room. The rocking chair was moving, slowly as though someone had just gotten up from it. A gust of cold air brushed against his neck. He spun around, but nothing was there. His pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't right. The cabin was warm when he entered, the fire alive, yet the place felt abandoned. And now the unbearable cold had returned. He exhaled shakily, watching as his breath misted in the air. The footprints. The ones that had disappeared. He glanced down. His own footprints were visible in the dust, but now there was another set leading directly toward him. A noise came from the bedroom. A whisper, low and unintelligible. Panic clawed at his throat. He staggered back, grabbing his phone from his coat pocket. No signal. He needed to leave. Now. As he reached for the door, a sound stopped him dead. The creaking of floorboards. Someone, or something, was walking toward him. Slowly, deliberately. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stood in the doorway of the bedroom, shrouded in shadows. Tall, unmoving. But the most terrifying part was its eyes, glowing, milky white, locked onto him with an intensity that sent ice through his veins. David tried to move, to run, but his body refused. The figure took a step forward, and the temperature in the room dropped even more. The fire, once roaring, snuffed out entirely. A whisper slid through the air, right against his ear. "You shouldn't have come." A hand, ice cold and impossibly strong, clamped onto his wrist. David screamed. The world around him twisted, the walls seeming to close in, and then nothing. The storm raged outside. The wind howled, but inside the cabin, all was silent. The fire in the hearth crackled once more, burning steadily as if it had never gone out. The rocking chair swayed gently. The footprints on the floor slowly faded, as though they had never been there. And the door to the cabin, once shut tight, now stood slightly ajar, allowing the cold wind to seep inside. The snow outside remained untouched. No sign of footprints leading away, no trace of anyone ever having been there at all. Story, the end.